Hi, I'm Natalie Berkloff, and I'm the librarian that's working with your Writing 300 class. This short video PowerPoint is going to talk about research questions. So when you're doing research, you first start off picking a research question or topic. Then you think about or brainstorm different areas to research, search to see what you can find about that topic, make a claim, and then support it with evidence, engaging with other scholars, or writing your research paper. So that first part, selecting a topic for inspiration, you might find a news story that made you think more about a particular topic. You might have a personal interest in maybe what your job or your field is. I like to use twitter.com and just search on Twitter. You don't have to have an account, but that might pop up with interesting news stories or organizations or people to follow. You might also look at association or organization websites for your field. For example, I belong to the American Library Association. There are associations and organizations for just about any career you could possibly think of. And then your own research. So maybe you just start searching a topic and something strikes your interest. For example, on this slide, I'm going to talk about public transportation. So that's my sample topic. I take public transportation. It's just a personal story of mine or interest, so I'm going to research that. So let's say I'm picking public transportation and I just do a search. I have no idea what kind of research has been done on public transportation. I use the library's homepage to do a search, and you can see that there is over 357,210 results, which is overwhelming. So you want to think about how to make your topic more problematic. So what are some things you could say about your topic that would be interesting or add to a conversation, in my case, about public transportation? Some things to think about is the relationship. So what kind of impact might public transportation have on different variables? I might narrow it down. So what specific kind of public transportation? What about public transportation am I interested in? Related to that, I could look at a different lens or facet. So in what particular context am I interested in public transportation? Or I could look at it demographically or chronologically, for who, for where, when. I could look at public transportation in cities versus urban or rural areas. I could look at it, public transportation for the elderly, for children. I could pick a specific city to explore. So when thinking about those relationships between your topic and other variables, it's helpful to think about that in terms of comparing and contrasting. So you might pick two different variables to look at. You could also look at how one thing influences or impacts another thing. You might look at puzzle pieces or parts of the whole. You might take an evaluative approach. So does one variable improve or deteriorate the other variable? Or you might look at successes and failures. So when you're thinking about how you want to approach a topic, these relationships can all be important. Some questions or some keywords that you might use in your research questions might be things like impact, effect, roles, solutions, results, benefits. So in my example, public transportation, I'm going to narrow this down and I could look at it from a variety of contexts. I could look at crime, policy, improvement of public transportation, quality of life, economic impact, human behavior, use of technology. There's lots of things I could select that aren't even on this list. So let's say I pick crime and I do a search for public transit and crime. A side note is that I noticed when I was searching for public transportation, public transit ended up being a better keyword. I still have over 1,500 results, but I can start to see what some things people are talking about. There was a study on Ottawa's O-Train system. There's also something on the Nigerian transit environment. I might, if I'm interested in just United States public transportation, add that as a keyword on the top. There's some articles that talk about does public transit spread crime, land use rise in crime and a fall in ridership. There's lots of things I could read or browse to help me narrow down my topic. So because I have over 1,500 results with public transportation and crime, I could narrow that down even further. You might already be thinking of ways I could possibly narrow down public transportation and crime. When thinking about how far to narrow down a topic, you want it to be broad enough to explore the different angles of a particular topic, but narrow enough that you could actually address whatever you're researching. And it totally depends on the length of the project. So a research question for a 100-page dissertation is going to look a lot different than a research question for a 5-page paper. There have been whole books written about specific topics, and you couldn't nearly cover everything in a short paper. You should remember that you shouldn't be repeating consensus and should not agree with all sides. You're making a claim eventually or an argument in a paper. And there should be places where you can enter the conversation. So what's something new or interesting you could say about a topic? To reiterate that last point, that you want to enter a research conversation about your topic, you want to make sure that you're not repeating someone else's research question. So in my case, if someone else has already researched public transportation on buses and I'm asking the same exact question about bus transportation, I might change my variable slightly and look at public transportation on metros or trains. You want to narrow it down to a research space so that you're building off of what other people are saying and not just repeating or rewriting the same paper that's already been published. So for example, if I'm researching public transportation and crime, I could narrow this down even further through looking at a specific type of crime. Maybe I look at robbery or burglaries or assaults. I could talk about misperception of crime, and I could also look at crime prevention. So again, I want to think about making it problematic. So what kind of relationship would it have? How am I narrowing it down? What kinds of lenses could I look at? Can I add a demographic or chronological variable? So I'm interested in public transportation and crime prevention and women. I'm interested in how we can prevent crime for women on public transportation and narrowing down my focus even more. So I do a search for public transit, safety, and women, and I'm getting some results that talk about gender. Some of these aren't related to me, so public transport in the First World War, that's probably not something that I'm interested in right now. So eventually I'll settle on a research question. Does crime prevention technology on public transportation improve safety measures for women? So I have a lot of things going on here. I have crime prevention and specifically technology related to crime prevention. So that might be apps. It might be different texting features where someone could text someone if they didn't feel safe. A reporting feature on an app. I'm looking at public transportation, which was my main topic. When talking about relationships, I'm looking at improving something. And that thing that I'm improving is safety measures specifically for women. This is crazy specific. So maybe I do a search and I find that there are no results. And that does not mean you need to change your topic. It means that no one has maybe researched that specific intersection of all of those variables, and that is what makes research exciting, and that's what makes for a good research question. So what do? Because no one has answered this research question before, is you look at research that's related to your question, and you as the writer make conclusions based off of the information you're reading. So you might read articles about gender and public transportation. You might read articles about gender and safety. You might read things about public transportation and safety. I'm sure you're all familiar with If You See Something, Say Something campaign. So you might find articles that talk about the effectiveness of that. You could look at public transportation and technology and safety. Just technology and safety, public transit and technology. So all of those things together might help you draw a conclusion or a claim that you could make about crime prevention technology on public transportation and specifically its impact on safety measures for women. So here are some examples of research questions based on what we talked about. Here's one. What are the negative consequences of social media? Is this a good research question? Hopefully you're answering no. And think about why it's a bad research question. It's really broad. It's able to give really specific answers, possibly. It's giving you too much room to explore. You would want to narrow down, what do you mean by social media? What do you mean by negative consequences? Through what context? A better example of that question might be, how do the images we post and see on Instagram impact our emotional well-being? And this one's good because it's focusing on a specific social media platform, one of the ways we use that platform, and looks at the impact through a specific lens, emotional well-being. You might do a search and find that this research question is just overly specific, that maybe not a lot of people have researched Instagram in general. So then maybe you back up on your research question and you talk about the images we post and see on social media and how those impact our emotional well-being, which allows you to look at things like Facebook and Tumblr. Here's another example of a research question. Is nudity censored too much on television? This is also an extremely broad question. How might you make it better? You could ask something like, how do American cultural norms impact the censorship of nudity and violence on television? So you're not just looking at nudity, but you're using that compare and contrast relationship between nudity and violence, and looking at it through the lens of American cultural norms. So it's good, it's specific, it's looking at the relationship between multiple variables. So finally, after you've read things that relate to your research question, you're going to make a thesis statement, and that's a claim. So you're going to answer your research question in your statement, which is an observation about the world around you, and it's provable. It's not an opinion, but it's also a statement that you can make that you can back up using different sources. You don't need to say, I think that, before the thesis statement. As a reader, we know that you're thinking it because you're writing it and you're not citing it, and so anything you don't cite, I assume, is your own idea. That wraps up research questions. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.